Bibles to Hosea, chapter 1. You got me up there? All right. In case you're wondering, he's right after Daniel. All right. Mike, would you pray for Sunday school? And when you do, pray for my mother. She's having this blood pressure problem. Amen. Now, how many of you are familiar with Hosea? It is a beautiful book. We're going to do the introduction and should be able to do chapter 1 today. It's a fairly lengthy one of the minor prophets. Candidly, I don't like the word minor for him, but that's how everyone refers to him, so whatever. These were prophets of God. They were no less important than Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. Their value is obvious because in the New Testament, they're quoted over and over again. The verse everyone knows, it's quoted 3 times in the New Testament, is the just shall live by faith. Everyone knows that verse, right? It's quoted in Romans, right? And Galatians, and Hebrews. It's one of the reasons we believe Paul wrote Hebrews, because he wrote the other 2 for certain. And in each book, he's explaining an aspect of those 6 words, right? In Romans, it's the just. How are you just with God? Romans teaches that. In Galatians, how do the just live? Do you live by law or do you live by grace, by faith? And he teaches that in in Galatians, excuse me. And in Hebrews, it's what is faith, right? The just shall live by faith. And so in just those 6 words, we have 3 books written to explain them. And those words come out of Habakkuk, okay, which no one ever reads. I mean, Habakkuk, what a name, right? But they come out of Habakkuk. And so he quotes Nahum in Romans, how beautiful are the feet of them, right, that bring good tidings of great glory. And he's talking there about the gospel, right? That's a quote out of Nahum. And so on. So these minor prophets, they're a big deal. It's important that we understand them. Now, Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, remember Israel split into 2 kingdoms after Solomon's death, right? So you had David, who was king of the whole thing. Now, not initially. If you read through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll see David initially was just king of the south, just his own tribe, and Benjamin, which always went along with Judah. Okay. Except when it was fighting the whole nation, which it did a couple times. But mostly they went along with Judah, and that's what had happened. And Simeon, it had disappeared as a tribe into Judah. It just didn't exist anywhere else. The northern kingdom, the northern tribes, did not go along with David initially. It took a few more years before they came on board. Okay? And then, so you have the unified nation under David and then Solomon. Solomon has a reign of complete peace. There's a reason for that. Okay, it's a type, right? David is a type of Christ's first coming, and Solomon's a type of his second, okay, when he's going to reign in peace and glory. So Solomon, he's an image of what the millennial kingdom's going to look like, okay? And so he didn't have to suffer wars and other things. It wasn't because he was a great guy. It wasn't even because of his prayer at the beginning. It was because he was a type. But he stored up judgment because he walked away from God. He fell away from God's will at the end of his life. And he did it by flatly disobeying 2 commands in Deuteronomy. One of them says you're not to multiply wives unto yourself. It specifically told the king not to multiply wives. And what did Solomon do? 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women. There's only 365 days in the year. Now, I know many of them were probably dynastic, treaty-type relationships, right? Marry the daughter of the king of Edom or, whatever, to keep Edom at peace and have a treaty with him. Not really ever have a marital relationship at all. Of course, you couldn't have a marital relationship with anyone, with 1,000 women. It's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's insanity. But he did that. And it tells us that at the end of his life, his wives turned his heart away from the Lord. And Solomon, at the end of his life, was worshiping idols, burning incense on the high places. That's crazy. The man who wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Now, I believe he turned that around before he died, simply because of Ecclesiastes. But he did that. The other thing he did was he brought in a bunch of horses. The Bible said they were not to multiply horses. Now, why would God tell Israel not to multiply horses to themselves? What difference does it make whether you have a horse in the land or not? Anyone have any idea? Yes, that's exactly right. Horses weren't used for normal stuff. They had mules and donkeys and oxen and things to use for work. Horses were about warfare, and that's all they were about. And God didn't want Israel to build a big army, and he didn't want them to put their faith in earthly warfare tools. He wanted them to trust him. So he said, don't multiply horses to yourself. But what did Solomon do? He brought in all kinds of horses from Egypt. That's what it says. He established a location for a cavalry and a chariot army at Megiddo. That's what Megiddo was. That's in the Valley of Armageddon, or also known as the Valley of Jezreel, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. He put the location, the central location for all of Israel's mounted army there at Megiddo. Okay? And that's a violation of what God said to do. He put his faith to defend Israel in military might. Now, Solomon didn't have to worry about that because God wasn't going to do anything while he was alive, because he was a type. Okay? He should have worried about it. But as soon as his son Rehoboam was king, judgment came. And Rehoboam met with the people, and he told them he was going to increase the burden, the tax burden on them. Solomon's tax burden was really high. As far as Solomon was concerned, no one should manage their own money. He could manage it all for everybody. And that's how he was. Okay? And so when Rehoboam gets to be king, the people meet with him and say, we want you to reduce the taxes on us. It's too high. The burden's too heavy. And Rehoboam rejects the counsel of Solomon's advisors, who said, speak peacefully to these people, and they'll be yours forever. Instead, he said, I'll be far worse than my dad. My little finger will be like his thigh. What an idiot, right? That caused all the northern tribes to abandon him. And the phrase they use is, what have we to do with thee, house of David? See to your own house, which is Judah, because the house of David comes out of Judah. And they walked away. And they established their own king, Jeroboam. Jeroboam had been a servant of Solomon, and he had tried to raise a revolution against Solomon, a rebellion, but of course that wasn't going to work. God wasn't going to allow those during Solomon's life. And he had fled to Egypt to avoid Solomon killing him, because Solomon would have put him to death. If you read when Solomon first takes over, he executes a lot of people. There's a crowd of people who die right at the beginning of his reign, right? Like Joab. Okay. The guy that, I can't remember his name, but the guy that cursed David as they were leaving, as he was fleeing from Absalom, he kills him. And there's another one too. So these people that had caused trouble for David during his reign, Solomon killed them all. So he was not hesitant to execute people. And so he was going to find Jeroboam and kill him. Jeroboam had to flee, and he fled to Egypt. After Solomon died, he came back and went to the northern kingdom, and they chose him to be their king. And so the 10 northern tribes split and became Israel, and they set their capital in Samaria. Okay? They were not Samaritans, they were Israelis, but that's the name of the city. And he was the king. He, to keep his people from going down to the temple and worshiping, because he thought that would separate his people from him, he wanted to make sure he kept control of the northern tribes in his heart, in their hearts. He didn't want them worshiping in Jerusalem at the temple, right? So he set up these two golden calves, one in the south and one in the north. He called them the Lord. He called them Jehovah. And he had his own priesthood do worship at those two locations. That is referred to throughout the Bible as the sin that Jeroboam, wherewith he made Israel to sin. It repeats that phrase over and over and over again, not only throughout his life, but throughout the life of his children and then other kings. That's that's God's statement about Jeroboam. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Okay? He didn't have to do that. God had given him the throne and promised him that he would protect him and make it his family's if he would be faithful. Of course, he wasn't. So we're now in this situation where we have these two kingdoms. They're both Israelis, Judah in the south, under the house of David, and Israel in the north, under a variety of different families, because they had all kinds of rebellions and massacres and overthrows, and different people took over. And they have that fascinating character, Jehu, which everyone, if you're a person who can't drive and stay under the speed limit, you're a Jehu, right? Because the Bible says he driveth furiously, and he was driving a chariot. And the people knew who he was because of how he was driving the chariot. They couldn't see his face. He was too far away. But they see him coming. Oh, that one drives like Jehu, for he driveth furiously. Right? But he put down Ahab and Jezebel and all of Ahab's children. He killed them all. And God told him to. And so he did. And then he killed all the priests of Baal. He said he was going to worship Baal, and he called all of the priests of Baal and all the worshipers of Baal to the temple of Baal in Samaria. And then they sealed the doors and burned the place to the ground. And anyone that tried to get out, he had his army around it, and they just killed him. He wiped them all out. Now that's good, as far as the Old Testament is concerned, mind you. We don't do that today. But in Israel you did under the law. That was righteous. But then it says he made Israel to worship the golden calves that Jeroboam had set up. Same sin that Jeroboam did. But because he was so effective at wiping out the house of Ahab, who, by the way, God tried hard to convert, he got 4 generations before God took his family off the throne and replaced it with a different one. So you've got to understand that the northern kingdom was a mess. It never had a godly king. Not one. In Judah, about 4 out of 10 of the kings were good kings. 6 out of 10 were bad. About 4 out of 10 were good kings. I mean, there's a list of them, right? Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Josiah, Joash. There were good kings in the south. Okay? People who loved the Lord and followed him. Israel never had that. Not one time. Every king they had was an idolater and opposed to God's word. So Hosea, he's a prophet to the northern kingdom. Okay? And that's why Israel goes into captivity first. They never had a period in which they were faithful to God. Not one. So a couple hundred years before Judah goes, they go. They just ratcheted up judgment until it came. So Hosea is prophesying to them. Now, this is in 785 BC it starts. It covers about 60 years. Hosea's name means salvation. Okay? It's Joshua without the J. That's what it is. So the name Joshua means Jehovah is salvation. Okay, that's what it means. Some people will tell you it simply means Savior. That's not what it means. The Hebrew alphabet is very specific when it puts those J's and L's into names. The L's always refer to God, Elohim, as part of the name. The J's almost always refer to Jehovah, the Lord. Okay? And so when you take Hosea, salvation, and put the Jehovah in front of it, it means Jehovah is salvation. That's what it means. Okay? That's what the name Joshua means. And that, of course, is the Lord's name. The name Jesus, same name. Jesus is how we translate it out of Greek into English. Okay? But if you spoke Jesus' name in Hebrew, it would be Yeshua, which was the same as Joshua. Everyone understands? But the New Testament is translated out of Greek. And so it comes to us as Jesus, because that's how it's spelled in Greek. And we transliterate names. Similarly, Mary and Miriam are the same name. Miriam's Hebrew, Mary's Greek, both translated into English. They come across. James and Jacob, same name. Okay? That's why in the book of Acts it talks about Jesus leading the people in the wilderness into the land. It's not talking about the Jesus on the cross. It's talking about Joshua from the Old Testament. That's who it's talking about, because that's his name. Everyone understand? Okay, so Hosea just means salvation. That's his name. Now, why would he have such a name? Well, he had godly parents. But understand, the names in the Bible, they're not accidents. They're not accidents. God chose names. He put them into people's hearts. In some cases, he told them what to name a child, right? In other cases, he left it up to them, but it was clear that he was influencing what their choices were, because all of these names have meanings. Okay? And so Hosea, God chose him to give this particular message to the northern kingdom. The message is, you're going into captivity. You're an unfaithful wife. You have played the harlot on your husband, Jehovah, and he's going to cast you off. He's going to divorce you. However, after a period of time, he's going to restore you and save you as a people, not individuals. Understand that. This message is not to individual people. It's to the nation, the northern kingdom of Israel. And so, and that's part of the context and the dispensation, understanding that. You don't read Hosea to understand how to be born again, okay? It's not a message about that. It's a message about God's plan, his eternal plan for Israel, and what he's going to do with them right now, because they're fallen fully, wholly into idolatry. And he uses the imagery of a marriage, right? He calls himself Jehovah the husband and Israel his wife. That's what we see throughout the book of Hosea, and we see that mentioned also elsewhere in the Old Testament, which is why, how many of you have ever heard a message on the Song of Solomon? It's rare, but how many of you have ever heard one? What do most preachers say it means? It's about? What's the most common understanding of the Song of Solomon? Christ in the church. That's what they say, right? That the husband in it is Christ, and the bride is the church. That's not right. That's wrong. Now, you can make application of it. It is absolutely appropriate to make that application. But understand some things. When was the Song of Solomon written? Well, it was written by Solomon, right? So it was written in the Old Testament. It was written long before the church. Was the church revealed in the Old Testament as an entity? Jews and Gentiles together as? No. The book of Ephesians flatly tells us it wasn't. It wasn't revealed until the New Testament. And it wasn't really fully revealed until Paul. Okay? So, since it's not revealed in the Old Testament, could the Song of Solomon be about the church? No. It's not about the church. It's about something else. Now, the plain language of the Song of Solomon is about a husband and wife and their relationship. And that's really the proper interpretation. It's God's sanction and approval of the marital relationship between a man and a woman. That's the main message of the Song of Solomon. It means that your marriage is something God approves of. He likes it, he loves it, he approves of it, and that all aspects of it, including the physical, are approved of God within that relationship. That's the real teaching of the Song of Solomon, written by a man who had 1,000 wives. But there it is. It's the Holy Spirit, really, that wrote it. Okay, so that's the main teaching of it. The first application of it would be to Jehovah and Israel. Okay, that would be an appropriate first level application, because Jehovah espoused to himself Israel as a bride. And then they played the harlot on him. And that's what happened. But you can make spiritual application of Christ in the church, but understand that's not what the book is about. It's appropriate to make that application because, in fact, the church is referred to as bride of Christ. And the marital image, Well, that could be a confusing passage, and it is, actually. It's one of the more difficult ones in Scripture. I know people think it isn't. When they read it, they understand all the words, they think. That's a tough passage, the one in Ephesians. Okay? But understand that the book of Hosea, what you're going to see is God discussing the relationship between himself and Israel. His, as he calls it, his wife who's played the harlot by worshiping idols. Okay? And he uses the imagery of the marriage of Hosea himself. He tells Hosea to marry a harlot. Now, in preparation, I was using Through the Bible by J. Vernon McGee. Excellent commentary, excellent. And he says that several people that he read about, when he was preparing his notes, several commentators said God didn't really say that when he, she wasn't really a harlot at the time. She became a harlot later. That's not what it says. He told him to marry a harlot. And that's what McGee says, and he's right. That's what God told him to do. And so he did it. Her name is Gomer. Now, why would he tell him to do that? Well, he's going to use his life, literally, as an object lesson to Israel. If you read the book of Ezekiel, you'll see he did that with Ezekiel repeatedly. He made him lay on his left side for 350-something days without moving. Think about that. Okay, why would he do that? Well, it was to picture the siege of Jerusalem. And so he laid him on his side, and he had this tile set up that looked like Jerusalem, and he cut his own hair, and a third of it he burned up, and a third of it he cut into pieces, and a third he threw up into the wind, but he saved a few strands in his skirt, the remnant, right? Meanwhile, he sets fire, he puts the hair in the midst of the tile and sets fire to it, and he lays on his left side for 300 plus days without moving. Then he switches to his right side and lays there for a couple hundred days. You think that was easy? Go ahead and try to lay on one side just for an hour without moving. So God, he demands some hard things from people. He also took Ezekiel's wife. He slew her. He killed her outright. Okay? Not because he was angry with her or anything like that. There's no doubt she was a godly woman. I have no question about her eternal security or anything like that. But because it was going to be an image. Like God had lost his people, his wife, Ezekiel was going to lose his. And what it says is God told him, you can't mourn for her. You're not allowed to mourn. That's harsh. And he says, Ezekiel writes, so in the morning, the delight of my eyes was taken away from me at a stroke. But he obeyed God and he did not mourn. Why? Because God was using him to picture himself. Okay? Well, he does the same thing with Hosea. Similarly, now, McGee says marrying a harlot was a violation of the law, but that's not true. It was only a violation of the law if you were a priest or a Levite. There's no reason to believe Hosea was either. Okay? And so marrying a harlot was not a violation of the law. Okay? God didn't tell him to break the law. I would add, God never breaks the law, nor does he ever allow anyone to break the law or tell them to. We misunderstand sometimes because we over-apply passages, right? Further, there's no evidence, even though she does play the harlot, and everyone knows it's true, there's no evidence that there were 2 or 3 witnesses of it. And that's what it takes to stone her. The law doesn't say you stone a harlot. It says you stone a woman who commits adultery if there are 2 or 3 witnesses. That's what it says. And there's no reason to believe in Hosea that there were ever any witnesses except herself, and she's certainly not going to be a witness against herself. And whoever she played the harlot with, and they're not talking. So you had no witnesses. That's why the woman taken in adultery in the book of John, Christ didn't set aside the law to free her from being stoned. There were no witnesses. All these men bring her to him and say she was caught in the very act, and he says, well, let you who is without sin cast the first stone. The witnesses cast the first stones. That's how it was done. Well, they all leave, convicted in their hearts. That's what it says, right? Holy Spirit, just one by one, and they all leave. Then Christ raised up and says, what? Doth no man condemn thee? And she says, no man, Lord. Well, then you can't stone her, no matter what happened. That's the law. So Christ didn't set the law aside, and God didn't hear either. Okay, he did tell him to marry a harlot. So, we have this opening here. I do want to read one little thing from McGee. One of the things he was really good at, I don't know how many of you ever heard McGee on the radio or anything. He's got a great voice, by the way, great radio voice. Not like these modern guys who sound like they're whispering at you. So weird. You know, who's that guy that has Focus on the Family? Dobson? He has the worst radio voice in the world. I just want to fall asleep when he's talking. I don't even know how he has a radio program. But McGee didn't. McGee had a great voice, okay? And according to him, he didn't have a southern accent. He had the language of God that everyone would speak in the kingdom and in heaven. But he says some comments here about what it's like when a woman goes wrong, you know, a woman who married. God shapes a little girl into a fine and delicate instrument, a woman, but when a woman goes wrong, the tragedy is immeasurable. The background of the prophecy of Hosea is the story of a fallen woman in a broken home. It is the story of that which must be contrasted to God's ideal of marriage and of womanhood. God uses this to tell his own story about his relationship with Israel. And so that's what Hosea is about. Is it appropriate for a woman to leave her husband and go be a prostitute? Because that's what Gomer does. No, right? That's terrible. Hurtful for Hosea, terrible for their children, because they had children before that happened, and terrible for Gomer. It's just horrible, right? Well, is it appropriate for the wife of Jehovah to worship golden calves or Baal? Obviously not. It hurts God the same way as a wife cheating on her husband would hurt him. And it does the same harm to them as a wife is doing to herself. Everyone see? So that's the imagery he's using. Now, he prophesied for about 60 years. He saw Israel taken into captivity by Nineveh. That happened while he was alive. But when he started prophesying, it hadn't happened yet. It happens down the road for him, but he was alive when it occurred, when he saw the prophecy fulfilled. He was prophesying at the same time as Amos, Micah, Isaiah, and Nahum. So those four were all prophesying at the same time. Nahum, of course, was in the northern kingdom, as was Amos. Okay, Isaiah and Micah were in the southern kingdom. They were in Judah. But they were all alive at the same time and prophesying. So there were 5 prophets speaking the word of God to the people of Israel at one time. Think about that for a minute. Is God trying to turn people around? He most certainly was. He was trying to get them to change their course. He was giving them warning after warning after warning. This is the story of an adulterous wife and a loving and restoring husband. What this teaches us, the husband goes out and he restores her. He brings her back out of adultery, I think twice. In the end, it tells us she becomes a better wife than you could possibly imagine, a perfect wife. In fact, Hosea does restore her. Well, God really, but you know what I mean. Why? Because God tells him to go get her and bring her back and reestablish her as his wife. Okay, and he does. Chapters 1 to 3 are the personal story of Hosea. All right, and so that's what we're going to start with. So chapter 1, verse 1. That was all background there. The word of the Lord that came into Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. That's Jeroboam the second. That's how he's referred to in the Bible, or well, not in the Bible, but that's how, when you look at a list of kings of the northern kingdom, he's Jeroboam the second. He's not actually a descendant of the original Jeroboam, just has the same name, but because there was a previous king, the first one of the kingdom was Jeroboam, they call him Jeroboam II, okay, or the second. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, go and take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms. All right, well, that's simple. What that means is find a prostitute and marry her. And this is a woman whose mother was a prostitute. That's what it says. And that's what he did. For the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So you see right there why he's doing it. He's linking the two. Right? That's the context. Why would he tell Hosea to do this? Because God is going to set Hosea up as a type of himself. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. So this woman was already a prostitute. Understand that. Before he ever married her, he took a prostitute and made her his wife. And the Lord said unto him, call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now, who knows where the valley of Jezreel is? Or any other names for it? Anyone? And what? Well, that's the last little leg of it. It's north of Jerusalem. It's actually the Valley of Armageddon. It's the same place. Okay, and so you have several major incidents that occur up there. Carmel, the mountain of Carmel, is on the west side of the valley, looking down into it. You know, it's a valley. It's got mountains on both sides. Carmel's on part of the mountains on the west. Okay. On the east are these hills and mountains, including Tabor, okay, which is believed to be the Mount of Transfiguration. Also where Nazareth is, it's in those hills, running north. So Jezreel runs through Galilee, okay, and it comes down out of the north. It was called the King's Highway. So if you were going to pass through Israel, you had to come down that valley, okay, and then it curves, it hits the mountains of Judea, which is where Jerusalem and Samaria are, and it curves out and then drops down past the Dead Sea, and the valley turns, changes its character into a desert. The Valley of Jezreel is beautiful and full of farms and everything else, and it's big. Okay, and now Megiddo's up there. Megiddo's on the east side. It's in the mountains on the east side of the valley. And also up there was the summer palace for the kings of Israel. Naboth's vineyard and all that. Okay, that's on this little spur called Gibeah, which is also where Saul and Jonathan were killed. Okay, and it's also the valley where Gideon went down, the little spring that he took the men to and had them lap or pick up water. It's right there at the base of, just to the south of Gibeah, looking right out in the valley of Jezreel, and that's where the enemies were. They were spread out in the valley of Jezreel. They were right there when they were drinking that water. I mean, within vision, easy. Okay, so this is a valley where a lot happened in Israel. Okay, and it's also the single most fought over piece of ground in the history of the world, so far as we know. More battles have been fought in that valley than anywhere else. Why? Well, because that was the central pathway for an army to move between the northern part of the world to Egypt, and then over to the east to Babylon and eventually Persia and so on. Okay, it was the major pathway. When Joshua took the land, there was a city to the north of that, Hazor. Anyone remember the name of that city? Joshua burned it to the ground. Okay, Joshua was a conqueror. He had no patience for for pagans and their cities. Well, Hazor was the city that controlled that valley. It's on a hill, this little standalone hill in the northern edge of that valley, the northern end, and it dominates the valley. You couldn't pass through that valley without dealing with Hazor. It was a fortified city with a king. Okay? If you tried to pass through the valley, they could sort you out and cause you all kinds of trouble. So you had to pay a tax. And that's what he did. He extracted money from everyone going by. Okay? Until Joshua burned his city to the ground and killed everyone. They didn't do that anymore. Later, Solomon reestablishes it as a military outpost for Israel. So that's the Valley of Jezreel, and he names this child, this first child, Jezreel, and he says, I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu. What's he talking about there? Well, you know, Jehu, when he put down Ahab and Jezebel and their families, that all happened in Jezreel. He killed someone else. Does anyone remember who else he killed? Who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? What's that? The king of Judah. He was up there visiting. and he got himself killed. Jehu had him killed. Well, that was a mistake. God never told him to kill the king of Judah. It's because of that death that Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, took over in Judah and killed all the seed royal, killed all the children. Okay? So I believe that's what he's talking about here. It's also possible Jehu just went a little too far. He killed a lot of people, okay, when he took over. But of course, he also led the nation into idolatry, and so his misbehaviors are going to be avenged. And they're going to be avenged in Jezreel, which means the Ninevites, when they invade, this is where they're going to finish the thing. They're going to take over the northern kingdom with a victory in this valley. He says in verse 5, and I will break the bow of Israel, that's northern kingdom, in the valley of Jezreel. Now, what does the word Jezreel mean? Does anyone know? These words matter. It means scatters. It's interesting that they named a valley as scatters. And she conceived again and bare a daughter. And God said unto him, call her name Lo Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. But I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. See, this theme is all throughout the Old Testament. God's people are not supposed to trust in worldly weapons of warfare. They are to trust God. Now, does that mean you can't fight? Well, did David fight? Yeah. Right? A lot. Was he wrong to kill Goliath? No. Do you think he trusted in that sling and stones? No. He says himself, I come to you in the name of the Lord God of hosts. He was trusting in God. But that doesn't mean you don't fight. It just means you don't trust in the weapons of warfare. Right? Goliath had all the weaponry of warfare on his side. He was armored. He had the big spear and sword, big shield. David had none of that. Later on, when David's fleeing from Saul, he takes Goliath's sword. That was a mistake. There was no reason to do that. He was putting his trust in a worldly weapon. And shortly after that, he's in Philistia, serving the kings of the Philistines. Why is he doing that? Because he was out of God's will. God intervened to keep him from doing anything too bad, but he was out of God's will. He was trusting in the wrong things. Why flee to Philistia? I know that Saul was harrying him, and he was. It was terrible. He was running all the time down in that southern Judean desert. But can't you trust the Lord to keep you safe? And David, I'm not trying to pick on David. He trusts the Lord more than me, although I would like to change that. But understand what I'm saying? He could trust God to keep him safe. There's no way Saul was going to kill him. It was never going to happen. But he got scared, and he ran to Philistia and put his faith in earthly and worldly defenses. And that's what God doesn't like. He says here in verse 7, will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. He says instead, but I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God. Now, what does this mean? Some people say, well, he's setting aside Israel forever. He's not. Notice first, he says he will utterly take them away. Have the 10 northern tribes ever returned to Israel so far as we know? No, they have not. But did Judah, after Babylon took them away? Did they come back? Yes, under Ezra and Nehemiah. That's what this is referring to. Okay, the 10 northern tribes disappear into Assyria and are gone. Now, they still exist. God knows where they are. He'll bring them all back when it's his time. But that's what this is about here. He's saying when it comes to the northern kingdom, they're going into captivity, and I'm not going to return them to the land. Right? But Judah I will. Okay. Verse 8, now when she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, which, again, look at the name, for I'll have mercy on Israel no more. The name means unpitied. It means no mercy. Okay. Now when she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, call his name Lo Ami. That word lo means no. Lo Ruhamah, no mercy. Lo Ami, what does that mean? It means not my people. That's what it means. For ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Again, speaking to Israel, the northern kingdom. means not my people. Now later we'll see that he says, in the place where it was said, lo ami, it will be said, ami. You are my people. He's going to turn that around. But he's using the children and their names as signs to Israel. He did the same thing in Isaiah, right? Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in a place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye are the sons of the living God. So he's going to turn this around with an uncountable multitude of descendants. They're out there right now in this world. They're a treasure buried, hidden in the world, in the field. The Lord gave everything he had to purchase the whole earth for the sake of that treasure. He's going to bring them back. That's what he says right here. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Now, we're going to stop there for today. I just want to say some things about Jezreel. That's where the Battle of Armageddon is fought, a part of it. If you go through all of the passages, and it's worth going through, you'll see that the Battle of Armageddon follows several stages. So in Revelation chapter 19 and Revelation chapter 16 and Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, it tells us that the beast is going to bring an army and come from the north. He's going to come through the valley of Jezreel. He's going to close in on Jerusalem. And he's going to ransack Jerusalem. Okay? But in the midst of that, something will happen that causes them to withdraw back north into the valley of Jezreel. What's that? Well, it's the signs of the coming of the Son of Man. It's the signs in heaven, and the moon is sackcloth, and the sun is blood, and all that stuff. Okay? They flee back away from Jerusalem when all that starts happening. And then the Lord returns, and he hits that mountain outside of Jerusalem. Right? And who comes back with him? Do you remember in Revelation 19? And the what in heaven followed him? The armies. That's what it says. And the armies which were in heaven followed him. Who is that? Well, I believe it's the church and angels combined. They follow him. So he brings an army with him. But if you read through the passages, you'll see he doesn't use them. He fights this battle alone. And so, you check Isaiah chapter 10, Zechariah chapter 14, Isaiah chapter 65, and you will see he himself goes out and he defeats them with the sword that comes out of his mouth, the spirit of his word. He defeats the armies in Armageddon, and then in the valley of Megiddo, or the valley of Jezreel, north of Jerusalem. And then he goes down to the east, defeats an army there. Then he goes down into Edom, also known as Bozrah, and defeats an army there that came up from the south. He wipes them all out, and then returns to Jerusalem. And it says he returns with his clothes dyed red with the blood of his enemies, alone. That's a king, right? I mean, that is a king. He doesn't need a single person to help him. He just goes out there and deals with the enemies of God himself, by himself, in his human body. That's pretty exciting. Okay? That's all known as the day of Jezreel, or so on. And then there's also a passage that's one of my favorite in Zechariah, where it says, multitudes in the valley of decision. Right? That's the valley of Jezreel. It's one of its other names. He's talking there about Judgment Day on the Lord's return, known as the judgment of the nations, when he gathers all the nations together to be judged for how they treated Israel. That's where that's going to happen. And that happens after the battle of Armageddon, when he's defeated everyone. So when this says, they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. That's talking about all of the battles of Armageddon and then the judgment of the nations immediately following. That's jumping ahead. Notice he said he would scatter Israel utterly, but there he says he's going to regather them. Why? Because what he's talking about is the difference between the millennial kingdom and everything before that. With Israel, they don't get regathered until the millennial kingdom. Judah got regathered before that, under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so he had mercy on them. Why is that? Well, it's because they had some good kings, and for a while they were faithful. They had periods of time where they were faithful to God. Now, again, this is not about being born again. This is about God's relationship with Israel as their husband. and how he's going to restore them and how he's going to set them back up. Anyone know what the word Armageddon means? What's that? No, that's Revelation or Apocalypse. It means to reveal. It means mountain of slaughter. That's what it means. Just terrible. I mean, they're going to die in droves. Why? Because they are going to oppose their puny human war-making ability against the King of Kings. And he by himself is going to kill them all. It says the blood will flow in that valley to the horses' bridles. I've been in that valley. I've floated over it in a balloon, actually. I've looked down on it from both sides and driven through it. It's a big valley. It's huge. It's as big as the Treasure Valley. Think about, well, not quite. It's close. Not quite. Think about blood filling that to the horse's bridle. That is a lot of dead people. It says that it'll take a year for the birds of prey to clear off all the carcasses. It's referred to as the feast of the great God. The day of Jezreel is a lot of judgment. That's what it is. It's good for Israel, though. Bad for everyone else. Okay? And so it's interesting to me that in this book in Hosea, where he has him go take a prostitute for a wife, they have 3 children. She's going to go run away here in a moment when we get in the next chapter and go back to her being a harlot. But he does all that, and he uses those children and their names as signs, and then he jumps ahead. He prophesies destruction on Israel. Then he jumps ahead to the end and describes the things that are going to happen at the end that have not yet happened. So they have to. All right? Any questions? His own brothers? Yes. No, he did his, I think they were cousins. They were his, Joab, for instance, was a cousin of his. And he had 2, and it was by one of David's sisters. They were the children of Zariah, and they were, Zariah was one of his sisters. And so there were 3 of them, Asahel, Joab, and I can't remember the third one. And David, I don't think he feared them so much. He just said, you're too bloody for me. And they were. They killed all kinds of people that he wanted left alive. And he never did anything about it. But Solomon did. David told him, as for Joab, don't let his hoar hairs come to the grave in peace. He told Solomon that, which is a pronouncement of, go get him. And Solomon did. Joab grabbed onto the horns of the altar to avoid being killed. And they went in and dragged him out physically. So anyway, Hosea, great book. We'll pick up on chapter 2 next time.